Okay, hi everybody. I'm just checking that you can hear me and see me all okay. Just also sorting out my camera so that the light is not right on my eyes. That would be useful, wouldn't it? There you go. That's a bit better. Excellent. Hi, how are you all doing? Thank you so much for letting me know, Tom. Hope you're having a good day. And yeah, I hope that everybody's doing very good in the chat. Is the last week of May somehow. I don't exactly know how that happened, but here we are. Summer is almost just around the corner. And well, we have a few minutes until we actually get started, guys. So, feel free to get comfortable until we roll, properly speaking, in about 3 minutes and a half. And in the meantime, since the chat is open, you're very welcome to say hi. Let us know where you're joining from, what are you doing, that you're well, all of those things. You're very, very welcome to make use of the chat for as long as it remains open. And I'm just gonna make sure that everything is running okay on my end in the meantime. But hey, hi Marty, thank you so much for joining us and welcome back. And those of you just arriving into the chat, just to let you know that we are about to start in about 3 minutes and a half with our last lecture on the Carolingians. So yeah, and we're just wrapping it up, and it's a bit of a mishmash of I guess lecture. We have different aspects that we're gonna be dealing with, but I'm sure you're gonna like it. Hi, Adriana. Oh, in Mallorca. So you're on vacation and you're still joining us. I like your dedication, Adriana. You have a I really value things like that. I would be running around like a headless chicken. So thank you for actually dedicating to us some of your time on vacation. It's very kind. Hey, Katerina, how are you doing? Welcome, Marie. How is Memphis doing? Hi, Polly. Hope you're doing good. And I'm so glad that you went through the one in Tomar. I mean I couldn't do a full proper touring there because it's a UNESCO heritage site and we cannot film in there, but we could take some snippets, and it's well, I know that a lot of people haven't actually heard of it, which is why I wanted to share it. But yeah, Portugal has a lot of beautiful heritage, and I'm kind of just trying to bring some of those places that are a bit less known to the forefront. But in about an hour from Tomar, you have Tomar and two other UNESCO monasteries, each of them wow worthy for completely different reasons. So go to Portugal. That's all I'm saying. Hey Beverly, you just returned from a okay. So so Adriana is on holiday. You've just returned from holiday. My goodness, I'm so glad you guys are having a good time. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, Helen. How are you doing? Thank you for being here. And we're about to get started in about a minute, guys. So thank you so much for joining us. And please do say hi in the chat. Let us know how you're hanging. It's always lovely to hear from you. And well, Beverly, honestly, it is a lovely, lovely place. And it's very inconspicuous because you go into the monastery, which also was part of a castle for the Knights Templar. Well, in fact, the whole town is built around the legacy of the Knights Templar. And it just looks like it's gonna be a whatever medieval castle, if you see what I mean. It's not even in the greatest, hang on, let me adjust this. It's not even in the greatest state of conservation in comparison to many other castles around Europe. And and then you go inside and it's like boom, and it just explodes in terms of decoration and size. And it's like, whoa, the little castle was hiding all this inside. So yeah, if you get the chance to go and visit Tomar, it's literally not that far away from Lisbon, but the best way to access Tomar from is from Coimbra, which is a beautiful town anyway. So there you go. Here I am planning your holidays for the future. I hope you enjoy them. Hi, Nilu. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you. It's lovely seeing you here. Welcome, Deborah from Seattle. How are you doing? Hello, hello, hello. And well, we're about to get started. I think I have literally about 30 seconds, my phone says, but I'm a little confused about the time because my phone seems to be going a little bit behind, but my computer goes a couple of minutes over. So we are in the baseline of when we're gonna get started with our last lecture on the Carolingians. So hello and welcome everybody. Hi Linda, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us. And well, I'm gonna do the lecture today in a similar way that we normally do it, but I'm actually gonna take questions at the beginning and at the end. So, hi Cassiti, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us. And well, since it's time to get started, let me say hello everybody. Welcome to the tour, to the chat. My name is Dr. Lilian Céspedes González. You probably know me by now, but in case you don't know, hey, hope you're doing good. Welcome, Rosemary. Lovely having you here. And today we're doing, like I said, the last lecture of our academy on the Carolingians, of this early Frankish society here in the early Middle Ages that has taken us on a roller coaster of names, family betrayals, and all sorts of things. So today we're going to be focusing more in the civilization aspect of things, just so you get a more, round understanding of how this whole empire is essentially built, overall, rather than just in terms of policy making and all of these emperors. And before we get started properly speaking, I'm just going to drop in the chat now quickly the ways that you can keep on supporting us here in World Virtual Tours through the Academy or anything else. As you probably know, everything that we do here is done through the generosity of your donations. So thanks so much for supporting us through PayPal and Stripe. And you have the links in there as well. And you also have the links for the upcoming tours and talks that we have running, which, by the way, the next one is with me next week on Monday, because Mondays seem to be now my my day for lecturing one way or another. And we are doing the brief history of the UK Monday next week, the 3rd of June, as preparation for the new academy that I'm releasing later on in June, which is the early history of Britain, of England specifically, from prehistory all the way up to the Tudors. So you will have us there. And hey, Joe, hi, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us. And well, before I get started properly speaking with the Carolingians, before I start sharing the PowerPoint and what have you not, I wanted to essentially leave you guys a few minutes to see if you have any questions that you wanted to ask about the previous lectures before we get started with a new topic. I'm very happy to solve some of those queries now, particularly because I know, since some of you have emailed me, that some of you are trying to, make notes for the test. I promise you it's a very easy test. But if you have any questions, please fire ahead now. We have a few moments that I have accounted for before we start with civilization, properly speaking. So, there is no question too big or too small. This is an open floor, so please go ahead for it. Hi, Marion. Thank you so much for joining us. And while you do that, I'm just gonna grab some very quick water. Which is, you may see me make a strange face. It's I drink filtered water and my filter is going off, so it tastes kind of funny. But anyway, yeah, I regret not having changed it. Anyway, moving aside, Renu, very basic. Yes. So this is a good question, Renu. And before we dive into it, just to remind you, the name of the Carolingians is a modern name that we have really given to them, properly speaking, because the people overall are considered the Franks. Then we have the Merovingians and then the Carolingians. And the Carolingian dynasty is named specifically the Carolingians on behalf of Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne himself, because the name that they used back in the day, Charles, comes from the Germanic and Latin versions of the name, which are Carolo or Carolus. So Carolingian, you see how it comes together. But it is in honor of them two, of Charles Martel and Charlemagne, and using the root name as the vernacular in that regards. I hope that makes some sense now. And no worries. Hi, Ronnie. Thank you so much for joining us. Any more questions? Please fire ahead, guys. It's no worries. And Lucia, I'm not entirely sure what you mean with Chinese, but there is no proper interaction with the Chinese language into the Carolingians. So if you want to elaborate, please fire ahead. I still have a minute or two that we can dedicate to questions before we get started properly. But otherwise, I'm not entirely sure. Hi, Doreen. What sources did you find the line of Pippins in? I went through Wikipedia and they must have them confused. The info that I found as to which Pepin was. Okay, so Doreen is kind of interesting because sometimes even, and this is even confusing for, French people themselves. there are certain kings that get their names mistranslated into English. So sometimes Pepin is actually Pippin with an I. And I know it sounds like crazy, but you will find a completely different set of information. In any case, the Pepinids and the Pippinids as different, branches of the actual family are all traced back through the family lineages. And in any case, the book that I use for this specifically, for all of my primary sources, which is actually one that I wanted to recommend to you guys, and I'll actually type it into the chat. It's called Carolingian Civilization, a Reader, which is essentially a big, thick book with lots of documents from the time period of the Carolingians that actually allow you to go back that way. But yes, and the other problem during this, I'm sure you know, is that sometimes Wikipedia, because it's an open source kind of thing, is it can be a little bit hit and miss. But part of the reason for that is that there is the Pepin and the Pippinids, and sometimes they get their links confused. So hopefully that will help. But if you can get hold of a Carolingian civilization, a reader, it's normally on open preview on Google. So even though you may not be able to access the whole book, you should be able to access a fair part of it. How will we receive the questionnaire? So Femke, you receive the questionnaire directly through to your email. So World Virtual Tours will be sending that not straight after this lecture, but in the next few days to get your answers, and after that you receive your title. So or the certificate, essentially. I would like to know about Chinese civilization and its links with Europeans. Well, Lucia, that's I'm afraid that's quite a broad question for what I can cover today. But in terms of the impact that the Chinese had in Carolingian civilization is very little, actually. The majority of what comes through to us from the Chinese actually comes from the Middle East, from the Abbasid and the Umayyad courts. But I have actually been considering putting something on Chinese history, at least in ancient or medieval China. So if this is of interest to you guys, remember that at the end of all of the lectures, you do get an email where you can send suggestions and, queries. Do feel free to, advocate for that at some point. And on that note, I am now officially gonna close the chat so we can get started properly speaking with this lecture and then take more questions at the end. No worries. Thank you, guys. And good. Well, good to know, Marie, because I have a bit of an unhealthy obsession with Imperial China because I am very, very fond of the literary genre of wuxia and gong'an, which are essentially like martial arts and philosophy all in the same thing. So I'm obsessed with them, and I would be more than happy to put something together around the period of the Three Kingdoms. But anyway, in the meantime, let's get started properly speaking with our lecture on Carolingians and Carolingian civilization. So let me just start the PowerPoint from the beginning. Excellent. So here we go. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is really the social issues that the Carolingians had. I've kind of mentioned this about a million times, that they are not one unified people. It's a congregation of many different Germanic peoples in the area of what is modern day, France and part of Germany. But I wanted to kind of highlight all of these different names so you truly understand the diversity of people that goes into this empire. It's the Franks being the mass of the group, the Alemanni, which are essentially another Germanic group with the Franks, which obviously give the name to the area of Germany in this day and age. Well, I say obviously, Alemanni is the exact same word that we use in Romance languages to refer to Germany, Alemania, Alemania, etc., etc. Then we have the Lombards, who are the Germanic peoples of the north of Italy, the Thuringians, which is a very specific part of the border between, France and Germany, the Bavarians in what is the historical region of Bavaria, the Basques in the south of France and in the north of Spain, and Slavs, because you may recall that the eastern frontier of the empire actually has a lot of connections with different Slavic tribes. And although that doesn't necessarily mean that half of the people around in the Carolingian Empire were Slavic people, we do have marcher borders. And as a result, there is a big, confluence of these people. So what is very important for you to understand is that the management of the empire from the point of view of the social perspective is that it had to be inclusive for all of these different people that have their own traditions, customs, and sometimes even languages, right? But at the same time exclusive at a local level, meaning that as much as the Basques, the Slavs, and the Franks are all going to be treated the same at overarching imperial policy, those local counts, those local people need to make some concessions for what is happening, for those communities that have different cultural affiliations. And that's not always easy to manage. That's the reason why, or at least definitely that and the mismanagement of the empire, particularly after Charlemagne, the reason why the Carolingian Empire as an empire itself only lasts about 80 years. Because, well, it's actually quite difficult to rule this huge amount of people when they don't necessarily all have a lot in common, which is the bigger problem here. Remember that it's only really the Franks to begin with that are even converted to a version of Christianity that would seem familiar to us. Many of these other Germanic peoples had different concepts of Christianity, and trying to essentially get everything come together, it's difficult in terms of ideology. So this is where part of the problems that come through, or the biggest issues that we have to create one single Carolingian society emerge from. It's very diverse with its advantages and disadvantages. Well, one thing that is quite remarkable, though, is that the Carolingian Empire is actually going to have serious changes in the economy that will affect not just the Carolingians, but also many people across Europe, and believe it or not, many more afterwards. And for the Brits at home, this is one for you, by the way, because what the Carolingians decide to do, this starts with with Charlemagne's father, with Pippin, but particularly standardized by the time of Charlemagne, is decide that they need to standardize all their mint coinage. Essentially, up until this moment in time, everybody was issuing their own coins as of when they could, and whichever way suited them. And normally they were following the Roman and Byzantine tradition of coinage in gold, which is not necessarily the best way of distributing wealth across people, if you see what I mean. So they decided the easiest way of making this kind of money accessible and also create a standard and control on the economy is by introducing a type of silver penny, which we call the denarius, using the Latin term, or in French terms is the denier. And essentially, these denarius and denier in silver are all entirely possible thanks to a massive change in the way that they create weight in silver for trade and for coinage. And this new, weighting measurement that they developed is actually the Carolingian pound. Believe it or not, guys, I know you're kind of thinking pound, as in like, British pounds or pounds for weight, whatever. Aha, it was the Carolingians. So how does the pound end up in the UK? Because, well, King Offa of Mercia, which was one of the factions in Anglo-Saxon Britain, a few years into this decides, hey, these Carolingian guys have the right idea. And he just borrows the system and boom. From the Carolingians to the British Empire, the pound is actually one of those very long-lasting legacies that the Carolingians leave behind, and that was very successful for their economy in that in that kind of strange way of doing things. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk to you from the point of view of social issues is about women. Now, we know women of the Carolingian people were still very much perceived as, auxiliary roles to men. It's probably no surprise. This is a heavily Christianized society with a very big military background. And as a result, well, women are often sources of support rather than necessarily main players. However, that is not to say that Carolingian women did not have, an important participation in society. We know that they were able to own lands, although they were quite few in number. And surprisingly enough, there are more women, or we have more records of women owning lands in the area of the empire that corresponds with modern-day Germany than France itself. Whether that is because of the interesting mix in population or whatever, it's difficult for us to discern. But it could be, a variety of reasons. Whichever the case, they could have land. And there are going to be some interesting changes to women and the role that they have in court and in general society during the Carolingians specifically, because believe it or not, this is going to be the moment in time when the Carolingian dynasty, as representative of the Franks, decide to move away from polygamy to monogamy to support their further claims to, the church. And you'll be thinking, well, what does that have to do with women and anything? Well, consider this. If now the law of your people is to be monogamous, your role as a woman has changed completely. Because in a polygamous society, you may have certain freedoms, certain roles, certain expectations. In a monogamous society, things change as well. So the dynamic of the genders in that sense, particularly in families and in the royal court, are going to be constantly under renovation. And something that we see is that their marriage policy is actually going to be very different during the Carolingians than previous rulers. And it is something that's going to take some transition, and it's not necessarily always going to be, crystal clear. We know that, for example, Charlemagne, despite being married, he still had concubines. He still exercised polygamy to some extent. But, there is clearly a changing in the dynamic somehow that is going to affect their lives and their success. But, well, we do know that no woman, particularly from the elite, from the nobility and in high religious places, were actually pivotal to promote and preserve a lot of the behaviors, values, and practices that we can associate with Carolingian culture in that regards. And one of the things that we know they were fundamental for is the impact that they have in Christianity. And that is because of something quite simple that you may have not thought about to begin with. Women, particularly women of the high elite, actually had access to a lot of people in their day-to-day lives that members of the clergy did not, right? Because monks tend to be in isolation and priests tend to keep within themselves in the pastoral community. But elite women had access to other women, to children, and to members of lower social strata that otherwise, certain members of the ecclesiastic team would not be able to connect. So realizing the power of influence that these women have are utilized 100% as a way of pushing certain Christian agendas. And the idea of purity, prudence, and virtue is very important for women in Carolingian societies because of this, because they're sort of, an example to follow. And on top of that, we know that religious women, specifically in Carolingian society, are going to be quite important in the production of manuscripts. And we will talk more about the manuscripts in a moment. But the two women that I've used to signify this are Gemma and Liutgard, who are going to be two of the East Frankish queens. So remember, within the empire, we have the empire split in kingdoms. They're going to be on the eastern side of the empire. And it's interesting because they are one of the very few women that we actually have some kind of representation of. We have many records for Carolingian women, but not necessarily know what they look like, which is, complicated in that sense. Well, now that you understand a bit more of the social issues that the Carolingians were dealing with, let's talk about the Carolingian Renaissance, or, question mark, Carolingian Renaissance. And you're probably wondering, whoa, what is the, question or the bunny ears for? Well, the thing is, this is a term that we use from a modern perspective. We obviously did not call this the Carolingian Renaissance back in the day, but I'll explain what we mean with it as academics. And you will see this quite often. Particularly in books and whatnot, to be specifically referred to as such. But the Carolingian Renaissance is essentially this intellectual revival that mostly happens, and we normally use this specifically to refer to the court of Charlemagne, all the way up to the sort of mid-9th century. And the idea behind the Carolingian Renaissance is that Charlemagne and his court of advisors draw inspiration from Greco-Roman societies, as we've seen all throughout. And as a result of this, the court starts flourishing in terms of the arts. We see literature and writing soaring, art and architecture, and even music, as you see here. This is actually one of the many illuminated manuscripts where we see new musical instruments coming into light during the Carolingian Renaissance. But on top of being a renaissance of the arts, as we've seen in previous weeks, this is also a moment of revival or renovation or reformation of the legal and religious processes. So there is a lot of stuff happening at this moment in time. Now, I am a little bit cautious of the terminology, as are many other historians, because it sort of reinforces the idea that the early Middle Ages were the Dark Ages, right? And that is rubbish. Is not true. There was plenty of culture. There were plenty of great people doing wonderful things in Europe and elsewhere before the Carolingians, grow up this empire. The Dark Ages is actually just a very unhelpful term that we normally apply to the Middle Ages, particularly the early stages of the Middle Ages, from a sheer misunderstanding of what happens after the fall of Rome and all the way up to the Renaissance, which is not helpful. So we try not to, overuse this word because it can cause, the wrong ideology around it. But it is important to acknowledge that the Carolingians did indeed create something interesting within their own context that will also have long-term consequences, not just for themselves, but for many other people in Europe and throughout time. So that's where we can consider this sort of golden age, if you like. I'm a bit more keen of the word golden age than Renaissance for sure. But the majority of this Renaissance happens essentially through the development of learning. Learning becomes a key important aspect of their society, of their culture, and it all is based on the 7 liberal arts, which are the pillars of wisdom. And most of you will probably know of these 7 liberal arts through the ways they were taught in the Middle Ages, which are the trivium and the quadrivium. So in case that you don't know, let me explain what these are. Essentially, the trivium is the first set of the liberal arts. People who studied the trivium were taught arithmetics, grammar, and grammar, rhetoric, and logic. I always get them mixed up. Those were like the basics to be an elevated, intellectual, well-educated person. You needed to know grammar, you needed to know language and how to speak to people, rhetoric for the same reason, and logic. So, you could get around life having a basic notions of mathematics and just how to operate from the perspective of common sense and philosophy. And then we have the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, so you can actually count, geometry, so you can have an understanding of how to build things, right? Think of the importance of architecture, particularly for church construction at this moment in time. Astronomy, because we know our ancestors were obsessed with the night sky. We often don't give them enough credit, but they lived in a society which, unlike ours, did not suffer from light pollution. And if it did, it was in very minimal stages. So imagine what would happen to all of these people fascinated with the idea of God and, supremacy when they looked up and they just saw all of these stars popping up in the sky. Astronomy was very important for the Carolingians and for many early societies in general. And the last one of the subjects that are taught in the quadrivium is music, because believe it or not, music was considered as science for Carolingian society and had actually been the same case in ancient Greece. So we see that direct transition happening right there. And again, consider the power and the impact that music had, not just in the court, but from the point of view of the religious community. These are the things that they taught and what they did. The majority of what they actually did was still very heavily connected with the church. So we need to consider that a lot of this involve sending the biblical message, often through the shape of psalms. But just so you can understand the importance of all this learning in the wider context, we know that during the Carolingian Renaissance, there were over 8,000 manuscripts that were produced in convents, abbeys, and monasteries, which is an insane amount. Very few of them have survived, but producing a manuscript in a monastery or anywhere else, it takes an awful amount of time, because it's one person going letter by letter with ink. 8,000 adds to an incredible effort. Well, now that we know more about this Carolingian Renaissance and the importance of learning overall, let me tell you more about language, because as I'm sure you guys gather with all of these random people everywhere, potentially speaking a variety of things, language was important for the Carolingians. And we actually know that there are very serious problems, particularly as the empire starts growing and as the Franks start, developing their area of influence between Latin properly speaking and Romance or vernacular. There were problems in pronunciation. There were issues where people weren't necessarily using the right Latin word, but the deformed thing that they just, spoke normally when they were in the street or whatever. And we need to ask ourselves this question: at what point are Latin and vernacular different, right? Where do we start seeing the proper split between what the locals are actually talking and what traditional Latin is? Well, it's hard to actually identify these things, but because the Carolingians leave us with a lot of records on the subject, and this is a hot topic for them, we reckon that there was a Romance vernacular language in the area of Francia in sort of the late 8th century, perhaps a little bit earlier, but we are confident that the use of vernacular Latin was on the rise by 842, because there are actually a couple of synods and capitularies that highlight this. So we know that there are going to be a lot of instructions onto how to actually do Latin properly and how to battle all of these, interjections in the language. And part of the reason for this, and the reason why the written word becomes very important, is because we start seeing an increase of outsiders to the Frankish realms with all of these Slavs, Basques, and other Germanic people, or the Lombards, that may not have that exact same cultural legacy, even though they may have a connection to Latin through their own, peoples. So there are changes in the language, one of which we always speak on, is the fact that people drop the endings of words properly speaking. So I guess it's kind of similar to like when we are talking in English and we just say hanging, but we don't pronounce the G at the end. Things like that, we start deforming stuff to suit our needs. And this is something not acceptable by the intellectuals, by Charlemagne, by his successors, or the monks. People need to speak properly, because having a proper language and having proper written word and learning is to them a sign of civilization, a sign of equating themselves to the Romans, to the Greeks, and therefore, carrying this very important background. And for this purpose, they are going to put a lot of emphasis in the standardization of the language. And this is how something wonderful happens, which is the development of the Carolingian minuscule. Now, you may not know about this, but just so you know about it, you have the evidence here on the right. This is a script from the 9th century in Carolingian minuscule. So what is the minuscule? You'll probably be thinking. I'm sure you all have heard of different types of script and writing, right? From cursive to whatever else. Well, all of these different ways of making letters existed in the early Middle Ages. But as I'm sure any of you who have had to read letters from 100 years ago would notice, different handwritings can make reading parchment or any kind of paper quite hard. So in order to avoid that problem, and particularly to help the manuscript production everywhere, they decide that they need to standardize the way these manuscripts have to be written, the ordinary handwriting, right? And that is how we come up with the Carolingian minuscule. It's just a standard handwriting, which is actually quite fast because of the way that the letters are created, which means the production of the manuscripts is also faster, and it's easy to read. I mean, even though you may not know exactly the meaning of these words here on the right, I am sure most of you would be able to make out, if not all of those letters, 90% of them, because they are pretty crystal clear in that regards. Well, this is all in lowercase, it's all curved letters, they have regular spacing, as you see. It's pretty much, like the letters you can do with the old rulers when you're learning to write as a little kid. And it also included standardized punctuation, which is very important because that way you knew when a sentence was actually over or not, if you see what I mean. And it actually got developed over a period of, essentially 3 centuries. But something that I also wanted to quickly highlight for you guys is poetry. Now, poetry is actually on the rise in the Carolingian sphere, and I selected this poem that I will read for you, which is one of my favorites, It's written actually by a bishop, believe it or not, Theodulf, who was bishop judge and actually one of the best poets of his time. And this story of White Wybod is essentially a characterization, a satire about a not thoroughly useful count, which also has certain qualities that would have seemingly be amusing for the standards of the early Carolingian court. And this is what this man says. Perhaps big-boned Wybod, our hero, may hear this poem and shake his thick head 3 or 4 times, and gazing fiercely, try to frighten with a look and a matter, and overwhelm me with his threats, even though I am not there. If, however, the king in all his majesty should summon him, Wybod would go with faltering step and knocking his knees, and his huge gut would go before him and his chest, and he would resemble Vulcan and Jove in his voice. So as you see, this is all a little bit of tongue-in-cheek and a bit of jest that this bishop decided to write about this man, which he obviously didn't have any particularly nice feelings for. And as much as this may seem like not necessarily super elaborate poetry to us, I promise you that the development of poetry for the Carolingians was very impressive and important, way of promoting themselves as a new cultured society. Because remember, again, in ancient Rome and Greece, poetry was one of the highlights of literature. So expressing yourself in an artistic way is not just a matter of prose, it's a matter of being good with words and making those rhymes. Well, we're now going to start talking about the pretty pictures. And before I do that, since I suspect that probably means we're halfway through the talk somehow, I will also drop in the chat now the ways that you can support us here in World Virtual Tours through your donations via PayPal and Stripe, as well as the links to the upcoming talks that we have all throughout June and July, because we have some new things coming, including my 2 new academies for June. For those of you looking at more art, we start with the Masters of the Baroque, and then, like I said, this one with the early history of England. Well, architecture is going to be very important because it's fundamental to the development of the church in Carolingian times. We know that during this time period, between the sort of late 8th century and the 9th century, about 16 different cathedrals are built and over 400 monasteries. Very few of them have survived, or rather, I should say, very few of them have survived in their Carolingian version, because many of these monasteries and different foundations and churches are going to become then the later foundations for Romanesque, and they will be changed over time, and therefore their Carolingian background is going to be almost, irrecognizable. But all of the sort of architectural patterns follow this general idea of the pre-Romanesque architecture, but normally a bit more standardized than anywhere else in Europe. So here in Lorx Abbey, which is actually one of the very few that has something even still hanging, on the left, you see remnants of the church, and you can see those round arches that start highlighting to us Romanesque. And you can see the early medieval wall that used to fortify all of this abbey. Lorsch was very important because it actually received a lot of royal patronage. So we know that this church was actually under a lot of, receiving a lot of money. And you're probably wondering what kind of constructions they were doing. Well, I can best simplify that with the, here we go, the shape of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Now, this church, as you see, is actually what we call a basilica. And a basilica church is essentially a long hall with an apse at the end and some colonnades, which is what you would see in the middle. The colonnades would be exactly like the archways that we have in Lorsch. But we can see some more details of this architecture with the next step, which is, of course, the Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne in Aachen. Now, I know we've spoken about the Palatine Chapel before, but I wanted to give you a few more glimpses of how this was actually built and how buildings like this were not just religious. In the case of the Palatine Chapel, remember, this is also holding an imperial function. And in fact, what you see here on the left, despite the beautiful marble on the walls and all of this decadence of decoration, is actually the throne room. That was the throne of Charlemagne. So to have the imperial throne in a building like this, the building had to be fit for purpose, if you see what I mean. And on the other side, you can see not just the decoration, which is vast, but again, how we start seeing these very thick pillars that create support to the vaults that then later on are going to be carrying an insane amount of frescoes and mosaics, as we will see in the development of the Romanesque. Well, that is what the Palatine Chapel has to offer, but it doesn't mean that things end at the end of Charlemagne's life. There is actually a lot more art and architecture that comes through at the time of his successors. And one of the best examples of that is actually St. Justin's Church, which was built during the reign of Louis the Pious. Now, the church that you're seeing right now is very heavily renovated, but those capitals with the acanth leaves that you're seeing and those pillars and arches, this is pre-Romanesque Carolingian architecture. As you see, is quite low, right? It's not a particularly tall building in that regards, and it's the same construction. It's a long building with the apse at the end where you would have the altar. But this is how the Carolingians built pretty much the vast majority of their ecclesiastical monuments. And the general idea is that because the Carolingians managed to standardize their pre-Romanesque, if you see what I mean, it sets really a huge baseline for what then later on Romanesque will become, alongside with their very abundant use of stones everywhere, which is a tradition that they actually get from their Gallic past, from their Gallo-Roman past. And this is how the foundations for this huge architectural style, which we were just seeing last month, will actually take root in Europe and dominate the best part of 2 centuries and a half, just because the Carolingians, in their process of building the country and religiously converting people, would have a standard for it. Well, now what about art? Because I've been teasing with this for a long time. I'm sorry, it's been quite some time, but I wanted to dedicate to art, the due proper time and credit. Now, in Carolingian society, the majority of the art, although there are frescoes and mosaics, the most exceptional pieces that they create is always in paintings and manuscript illuminations, because like we were saying, so many manuscripts were being done, right, that the development of those artistic skills had to be seriously quite important. So it is key to Carolingian society, to Carolingian civilization, to the Carolingian Empire, anything. It's crucial. Well, these ones that you have in front of you right now are from the time of Charlemagne. So again, I will start with Charlemagne and then we will kind of do a time lapse moving forward. This is what we call the goddess calc. I think it receives different names, but normally I refer to it as the goddess calc lectionary, which essentially means that it was supposed to be a book for teaching the Bible, essentially, and perhaps one of the earliest examples of the art produced by the Ada school, which was one of the court schools that Charlemagne actually funded out of his own pocket. So this was not necessarily done by monks in a monastery. This was by actual intellectuals that Charlemagne himself hired. As you see, we're talking of full-size, vellums that are being decorated from the top to the bottom. And in fact, the manuscript itself is very interesting because it does kind of create a fusion of different art styles from their own contemporary cultures. There are some Byzantine influences, as I'm sure you can see on that Christ, some Hiberno influences from the Celts in Ireland. But what is more remarkable is that this is I think it's 127 pieces of parchment that make this book, all written in gold and silver. So imagine the expense, and the vellum is purple. So that means that although you may not notice it here on the digital copy, the pages had to be dyed purple beforehand to create the manuscript that you see here. So, the degree of production is just over the top. Well, if you thought that was cool, let me introduce you to another even cooler gospel, which is the Aachen Gospels, also created by one of the schools that was, under the patronage of Charlemagne himself. This is still, by the way, at Aachen Cathedral, is still considered one of the most important treasures that the cathedral has. And it was all written in Carolingian minuscule. So it's a good example of how successful that calligraphy was essentially. And what makes this very interesting, which by the way is dating from the early 9th century, is you see the border of this image, which is actually the four evangelists. You see how that is essentially like architectonical piece, almost like if somebody was framing this as if this was some kind of entrance to a garden or to even a monastic institution. That frame, which seems to follow architectural features, is very unique to Carolingian manuscripts in that regard. Well, now, let's move away from the time of Charlemagne, because actually some of the best manuscripts that the Carolingians made come after him. And here we have something quite remarkable. This is the Laudibus Sanctae Crucis, which is actually a very interesting piece of work created by Rabanus Maurus, who was actually, well, this man has many different titles at his name. He's a monk, poet, theologian, encyclopedist, one of the most important encyclopedists of the early Middle Ages, and most importantly, Archbishop of Mainz. And this man gave us this huge collection of essentially what we call graphic poems. So as you see the letters all written down perfectly straight line with this image in the middle, and even the text goes over the image, right? Well, these graphic poems were essentially supposed to be utilizing the iconography that you see on the page to help the reader understand the meaning behind the poem. And in his case, on top of writing the poem, on the other side of the page, he also wrote a bunch of explanations as to where he was trying to go with it, which is quite rare and, very interesting from the point of view of the didactics and the learning process of it all. But it's a wonderful example because we don't have many of these kind of poems. He actually created a total of 28 for this particular piece of work, and all of it has to do with our religious explanation about the cult of the Holy Cross, in terms of its religious context. Well, let's move on to the reign of Lothair, because actually, believe it or not, the Lothair Gospel is considered the height of Carolingian art. This actually came from a very important school, from the workshop in San Martin of Tours. And I think you can tell how the evolution has happened, right? From that early Aachen and even Maurus' work to this proper, fully fleshed body of drapery with to sort of 3D imagery that we don't necessarily see as much before. And of course, the color, which is ever so vibrant. Well, the Gospel specifically is dated from 850. And like I said, it is considered the height of the manuscript illumination of the Carolingians because of the degree of detail. But in general, the School of Tours seems to replace what is happening in Aachen at many stages. And it is from the School of Tours that something else comes out of it, but in the reign of Charles the Fat, which is this, the beautiful Vivian Bible. You may also know this as the first Bible of Charles the Fat. We call it the Vivian Bible because it was commissioned by the Count of Vivian, who was actually the patron, or one of the patrons, sorry, of San Martin of Tours. And again, the degree of decoration that goes into these volumes is just magnificent. The amount of work that went into this is remarkable. We're talking of several hundred pages, completely illuminated, plus in the actual manuscript writing form, which tell us not just the different views that the Carolingians had on religion, but the aesthetic sense that they had developed overall as time went on. Well, now we're going to finish this with a very different type of art, which perhaps may be surprising, but I thought we will finish on something slightly different. This is the cover of the Codex Aureus of Saint Emmeram. It's important that you note that it's of Saint Emmeram because there are about 10 different manuscripts in the Middle Ages with the name the Codex Aureus. And this is something quite remarkable of Carolingian society. We know that many of these manuscripts, many of these books that you've just seen a moment ago, had hard covers, often very highly decorated in ivory or gold, like you see here. The metalwork and the general work that we see um, done under Carolingian patronage for goldsmiths is supreme. And I'm sure here you can see how they do the engraving alongside with the inlaying of these gems. Well, the Codex Aureus actually dates from 870, and it has, I don't think we've actually counted how many gems, but as you can see, it's a huge combination of them, and it is containing a mixture of emeralds, sapphires, rubies, pearls, agate, and I think it's also some kind of garnet. And it's not just the fact that he's just put the gems in there. To put those gems there, you need to essentially create this little gem bed that you put as an inlay into the gold plaque itself, and then create a clasp to ensure that it's not moving, right? So the degree of craftsmanship that goes into creating things like this is frankly quite fascinating. It's not, let's just say, only typical of the Carolingians. We know that a lot of the early Germanic societies did a lot of work in gold, but the covers for these books from the general Carolingian Empire are absolutely magnificent and something kind of out of this world. And then there is something even more remarkable, which is this last piece. This is the Lothair crystal. For those of you who live in the UK or that may visit London anytime soon, this is actually held in the British Museum, by the way. And it's also sometimes referred to as the Susanna crystal. This is essentially an engraved gem. It's clear quartz of about 11.5 centimeters. I don't know how that translates into inches, but well, it's not bigger than my hand, really, in that sense. And it dates exactly from the year 855 to 69. We have pretty good dating for this one. And as you see, it's a beautiful carving into quartz, telling the biblical story of Susanna and the elders, which, if you don't know, I'll summarize very quickly. It's a story of the book of Daniel, where essentially this woman, Susanna, is just taking a bath, and a couple of older men are having a natter outside, and on their way back home, they actually see that she's having a bath in her private backyard, and they essentially just decide to look at her. When she becomes aware that this is happening, she sort of tries to run away from them, but the couple of men actually try to sort of pursue her and force her into some kind of sexual activity, for which she straight up refuses. And then they accuse her, because she refuses them, of essentially adultery with a young man under a tree. And she was about to essentially being just mistreated and judged for this crime, until Daniel intervenes and says, whoa, this is not how we do things. The elders should actually be questioned to make sure that Susanna is actually, not being done wrong in here. And that's essentially what this all is, recorded in a piece of quartz that is no bigger than my hand. If the degree of detail that you see in there is not blowing your mind, then I don't really know what I can show you on the screen to achieve that, because it is actually considered one of the most incredible treasures of the early Middle Ages, definitely of the Carolingian times. And the funniest part is that we don't actually have a clue why they made it. We're not entirely sure what the purpose of it was. There are actually many different theories around it, but the degree of craftsmanship is amazing. The gilt that you see around it, though, comes much later. It was added in the 15th century to protect the quartz from potentially damaging, which you can see very clearly goes through the crack in the middle. But it's a magnificent piece of art that really goes to highlight the degree of exuberance, detail, panache, and everything that the Carolingians wanted to be remembered for those huge changes that their empire, their civilization, and society did in the area of France in a matter of 200 years. And I know 200 years may seem like a lot of time for things to change, but consider that in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot. It's literally a drop in the ocean. And with the with the Crystal of Lothair, I have a couple of recommendations to adapt. So for the general idea of the Carolingian Renaissance, I really think you should go and check out Ullmann's work on this. If you want to look specifically at the architecture, Conant's work on Carolingian and Romanesque architecture is very thorough. Then for those of you obsessed with the manuscripts like myself, Bischoff is a great historian and he will really run you through that with a lot of detail. It can be a bit overwhelming, but it's a good book. And those of you wanting to know more about women in Carolingian society, Garver has made several publications on the subject, but this book specifically is, I would say, the best of all of them. And on that note, I am just about to open the chat, guys. So feel free to ask any details that you would like me to clarify. And while you do that, I am just gonna grab some more of my not so tasty water and fire away. The floor is entirely yours and the chat is now open. But I hope that that's been insightful into, you know, what the Carolingians achieved as an empire and beyond. So one sec and I'll be right back. Yeah, I definitely need to change that filter. It's it just tastes like I just threw a bunch of stones into my water. Right, let me just catch up with the chat very quickly, guys. Right. Oh, no worries. Thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed that, Asrith. The poem, well, yeah, the poem was very interesting, right? And a little bit, I think it just gives you at least a little bit of an idea into the humor of the time as well. These people were serious, but they also needed entertainment. You know, we always have this idea of the court jester, which, you know, it can be a little bit mystified, but entertainment had to happen at the court. And there was always somebody to make fun of. And even though you may be a bishop, I guess that doesn't exclude you from wanting to say something funny about someone else. And yes, happy Memorial Day in the US, by the way, for any of you who may be commemorating or celebrating. Where is St. Justin's Church? St. Justin's Church is just in the periphery of Frankfurt. It's literally just a small town outside of Frankfurt called Host. And it's not a very big population, it's quite tiny, but it is in the surroundings of Frankfurt itself, not in Frankfurt city, but just, you know, in the metropolitan area, in the countryside in there. And no worries, thank you so much, guys. Yes, I'll put up the books again, Linda, no worries, no problem at all. Excellent. What does it explain even more in depth in the poem? Do you mean in the illuminated poem, in the graphic poem, or in the or in the one that the bishop wrote? Because in the illuminated poem, all of the graphic poems that this specific archbishop writes are all essentially rhetoric ways of helping people understand the worship of the Holy Cross. The Holy Cross has been very important for Carolingian liturgy, for the Franks, really, pretty much from the beginning of their conversion with Clovis the First. But in general, the cult of the Holy Cross in early medieval Europe for Christian societies is very important because it's almost like the only thing in which all different Christian factions can sort of agree upon, you know? This is the moment in time where we're seeing a lot of potential texts that are going to be later on dismissed as not being valid by the Vatican. So the cult of the Holy Cross is important because regardless of which branch of Christianity you may come from, you understand its meaning. You understand that it is a devotion to God, that it is a representation of the sacrifice of Christ and the reason why you are a Christian and the values that you want to pass on to people. So it sort of digs into that in a very, you know, allegorical and metaphorical way. Lost Abbey, I think the photo, no, the gatehouse is actually very similar, but it's more decorated. So the gatehouse is bigger and also a little bit wider, and the front end is actually very heavily decorated with a lot of images with little paintings and whatnot. They look very similar though. The gatehouse in Lourdes is actually considered the biggest, most complete building standing, while the back end of the church is literally just a small building that is just there. But they are similar. The problem is they were built in a very similar fashion. But there are two of them in that sense. Hi, Renu, just getting to your question now. Where did they source the gold and the gems? Well, this is the $1 million question, right? Well, we do know that at this moment in time, in the early Germanic societies, particularly the Goths, that will start exploiting these, the original deposits of gold that they start exploiting for this actually come from the Black Sea. And it seems that it's actually through the Middle East and connections in Eastern Europe where a lot of that gold will come from. Sometimes this gold is also reutilized from spolia, which is essentially the spoils of war or treasures that they may find from ancient people or other, of their adversaries. And likewise with the gems, we know where the vast majority of the, or at least known mines of certain gems are in the world at this moment in time. We know that a lot of these things came from Asia and some of them even from Africa. The pearls are a bit more easier to find in the terms of, we know that they can come from different parts of the seabed, but this once again highlights the access to stuff they had, all over through their network. So they can come from pretty far away, and of course that means it was much more expensive. So, you know, um, it's difficult to believe that they would be so well connected, but they generally were. Oh, Joe, thank you so much. I'm so glad you have enjoyed it. It's my pleasure. And Harv, well, we actually think that it is a kind of like a primitive version of a bow drill, which is the same way that you do a sculpture on, on marble. But it's we are not entirely sure that is the case. It seems to make the most sense because, quartz is a material that has quite a high, high resistance, maybe not comparable to marble, but close enough. But at the same time, that degree of refinery, we wonder if perhaps they use some very, tiny, tiny chisels, because you cannot put really a proper size chisel in there. Perhaps something like similar to what you would use to create the forms in goldsmithing, but adapted to the quartz. So we have a couple of ideas of how they would have done it, but it would have been a painstakingly work to do, and they probably used a magnifying glass for it. Because otherwise you could go blind looking at it, if you see what I mean. It's quite a high degree of detail, but it would have been one of those two tools for sure. Right, let me just quickly put the links into the chat for the ways that you can keep on supporting us in World Virtual Tours through your donations via PayPal and Stripe. And I'll answer a couple more questions before we go. Is the mini school what we base modern writing on? Well, not entirely, but it's going to be essentially the baseline for what the rest of medieval scripts will become, and later on, of course, the modern standards. So it's not all of our modern writing that is based down to the minuscule, but it's definitely the first standard that will get us there, Bandit Queen. So without the Carolingian minuscule, we wouldn't write the way we do, one way or another. We cannot claim that it's all thanks to it, but in great part of it, for sure. And thank you so much, guys. You're very kind. Remember that if you have missed part of this, you will still get access to it for a couple of days on the World Virtual Tours website and on YouTube, because remember, this one is being live streamed. Oh, Marie, thank you so much. And yes, I could have done literally a class on each of them, but because we had already done art and architecture, I kind of decided to, snatch it aside. So I'm so glad that you have enjoyed this. And yes, the White Wibbot is a very funny poem. The version that I've put in here for you guys is the abridged version that is in the book that I was recommending earlier, Carolingian Civilization, Arida. The actual poem itself, it's a lot longer. So imagine how many more things the bishop had to say in this particular case, Was Hildebrandt of Bingen living during Carolingian times? I believe Hildegard is actually a little bit later with the Ottonian dynasty, but don't quote me on this one. However, there is another woman that will be very important, which is called Duoda, who actually writes a book, which is not necessarily my favorite illumination in answer to Bandit Queen, but it's definitely my favorite book of the Carolingian uh, empire. Duoda writes essentially like a book of advice to her son on how to do life as an adult. But in that how to do life as an adult, she also includes a lot of very good advice, from mother to son, which is remarkable, and that gives us a lot of interesting insight into the world that they lived in. What is the meaning behind the bull having the same gold halo as kings and queens? Well, Doreen, because the bull in this case probably more likely the ox is considered part of the Holy Nativity. At this moment in time, the Nativity, because of baptism and the birth of Christ, is very important. So a lot of the characters around it receive the same treatment as if they are holy holy I'll say it holy people in that regards. Excellent. Well, I think we are pretty much out of time, and there is another tour in about 25 minutes. So if you're around on World Virtual Tours, do not miss the next one, which I believe is in Machu Picchu. So please go and have a look at that. But it's time for me to go. So just dropping the links one more time in there, guys. Thank you so much for all your comments. And I'm also gonna drop in here my email in case you have any questions that I've not been able to answer, or any questions in looking forward towards the little test, which I promise you it is easy. You're always very welcome to fire ahead. And well, if you are around next week, although a little bit early at 5 p.m. BST this time around, we will be talking about the brief history of the UK in an hour. And then once I come back from my brief holiday back home, we start with two new academies, with the Masters of Baroque and with the early English history. So on that front, I will love you and leave you guys. I hope that you have a lovely rest of your week and take really good care. Thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.